Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, and students. On behalf of World Information Transfer, I would like to express our deep appreciation to the government of Ukraine for co-sponsoring the 22nd International Conference on Health and Environment, Global Partners for Global Solutions, and the missions of Hungary and Singapore for supporting it. I would also like to express our gratitude to His Excellency Yuri Sergeyev, Permanent Representative of Ukraine, Mr. Thomas Gass, Deputy Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs, UN DESA, Mr. Nihu Seth, Director of Division for Sustainable Development, UN DESA, our esteemed speakers, and the University of Westchester for bringing a couple of busloads of students, the future of this planet. World Information Transfer is dedicated to the studying the connection between environmental degradation and human health, and in identifying solutions to remediate our environment, and by doing so, improving the health and quality of life of Earth's citizens. Each year, for the past 22 years, I have been reciting a list of accomplishments that have galvanized the global community to attain sustainability. Unfortunately, with all the knowledge that all of us have gleaned, most of our leaders still do not have a deep connection to the Earth, and our planet is continuing to degrade, as well as the health of its inhabitants. The world can get along, as Dr. Robert Solow of MIT stated, without natural resources. So exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. But can the inhabitants? Can we? We have been listening to the ills of our planet since 1972, the first United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm, Sweden, and have been conscious that we are living at the expense of the future by exhausting the resources that will be needed by the future generations. We continue to contaminate the air that we breathe, fill our land and water with waste disposal, destroy our forests at an unprecedented rate, erode our fertile soil, destroy our ozone layer, and continue to exacerbate our climate and the extinction of millions of species. We thought that environmental problems were attributable to ignorance, inadequate government, administrations, and multinational companies. To some extent, this is still the case. There are countries that lack the necessary technologies due to many difficulties that they are facing, including lack of enabling environments due to the lack of good governance and rule of law and population explosion. Others still profit from the sale of pesticides and dumping of toxic materials in the developing world. We have learned that environmental issues are of international concern and need international collaboration. However, this growing awareness is progressing at a much slower pace than the destruction of our habitat. A social order that was created by cultures without fundamental world justice cannot sustain itself. We need to change the culture, whether one of consumption or one that gives rise to increased populations. Both are unsustainable. Our present civilization, our culture, our values are endangering our world, and it is up to the young generation, those that will lead the future, to galvanize those that are unable or unwilling to attain a culture that will benefit future humanity. That is why I am so proud that each year at our conferences we have large numbers of young people, as they need to hold all of us accountable, since we already live on their expense, and those who will come after them. In conclusion, I would like to end with a quote from Jonas Salk, medical researcher and developer of polio vaccine, who, when asked who owns the patent for this vaccine, answered, "Why, the people." Thank you. Okay. I wanted to mention that this session is webcast, also that all of the speeches are going to be on the internet. All you need to do is check with our immediate director. And at the present time, I would like to introduce Ambassador Yuri Sergeyev, is the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations. Mr. Sergeyev has been the permanent representative since May 2007. Prior to that appointment, he was ambassador to France, during which time he was also permanent representative of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Ambassador Sergeyev has also been the Secretary of State at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Ambassador to Greece and Albania, and headed the Foreign Ministry Directorate for Information. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach, for introducing me. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, I am honored to represent Ukraine as a co-host of this essential open dialogue at the United Nations that give us an opportunity to discuss a number of the most relevant items of the United Nations Development Agenda. First of all, let me thank the co-organizers of this event, Dr. Kristina Durbach and the World International Transfer, for being sustainable host and partner for these conferences during the long 22 years. I would also like to welcome our distinguished speakers of today, Mr. Nihil Set, the Director of the UN Sustainable Development, the representatives of the missions of Hungary and Singapore to the United Nations, and our colleagues from academia, Princeton and Columbia universities, and from the Electric Power Research Institute. Dear colleagues, Ukraine is confident that broad international discussion within the United Nations is a fundamental element in order to frame the national and global priorities for the future development programs of the United Nations. The topic of our conference is sustainability risks. However, let me say a few words that World Sustainable Agenda is a long process, which was started almost 15 years ago. In the year of 2000, the United Nations Millennium Declaration defined a global vision of the development in the form of the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. These goals have a clear system of targets and indicators, as well as time frames for achieving them. Reaching the MDGs means real changes in people's living standards. In September this year, world leaders gathered in the Special General Assembly event to discuss the efforts made towards achieving the MDGs. It was highlighted that with the 2015 target date of the MDGs fast approaching, the outcome document should focus on existing gaps and weaknesses of the MDGs, accelerating of implementations and looking forward to the post-2015 development agenda. The country stated that during the past 13 years of two left, we have achieved a lot, especially in poverty eradication and health care. Since 2004, and being the first post-Soviet country to adopt the MDGs, Ukraine has prepared a number of annual monitoring reports. In September 2013, Ukraine presented at the United Nations its third national report on acceleration of MDGs. This publication incorporates the assessments of 200 leading experts from various scientific, economic, and research institutions. It is also available online. Dear colleagues, there is no doubt that every developing nation is striving to reach Millennium Development Goals and incorporate successful achievements into the post-2015 development agenda. It means that in 2015, after the MDGs are achieved, the member states will need the new guidelines for their post-2015 agenda. It means that we need to elaborate the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. The UN member states are now in a challenging process of outlining their positions to the issues of sustainable and inclusive economic growth, macroeconomics and infrastructure development, as well as climate change, health, gender equality, and many other topics. I am sure that Director Nihil Set has much more to explain, being the UN captain for the MDGs and SDGs. But I have to add that Ukraine, as well as other UN member states, are now in a challenging process of outlining their key priorities for the potential development strategies for the next decades. I would emphasize that Ukraine supports the activity of the General Assembly Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, where countries can discuss their SDGs priorities. By the way, its 5th session was ended successfully just last week, and Ukraine has presented its view on an energy issue. We are confident that national economies should grow and social standards should rise in the future decades. Therefore, energy should be definitely included into the SDGs agenda. However, energy item for Ukraine's economy is a multi-sided issue and has the diversified approach for the energy supply and production without compromising its sustainability. Renewable energy is becoming an integral part of the energy system. However, because of the cost and infrastructure still remains a challenge. Ukraine's reliance only on alternative or renewable energy sources or burning of fossil fuels will not resolve economic and social development issues in the future. By saying that, I mean that over 50% of energy supply in our country is produced by peaceful atom. We believe that sustainable nuclear energy approach should be taken into account by the member states, especially those which rely on such technology. The new approach must ensure comprehensive consideration of security, social and environmental aspects, particularly in priority areas such as ecological safety, comprehensive environmental conservation, and prudent management. Only such approach will facilitate sustainable development of energy, especially as regards efficiency and safety of its nuclear sector. Having Chernobyl resolution on the General Assembly agenda, we are confident that immense experience of almost 30 years of long activity of how to manage and revitalize the nuclear accident consequences should not be lost for the international community. Dear colleagues, I try to shape the main ideas for the Ukrainian delegation in the United Nations Development Agenda. And now I guess that it is time to listen to the views and approaches of distinguished colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Your Excellency, for giving us an update on the sustainable efforts of Ukraine, which basically has co-sponsored this conference for 22 years. So, before we continue, I would like to remind you that it has been our tradition not to take questions from the floor. Please fill in the questions, and the monitors will collect them, and then all the speakers are going to be able to answer them. Thank you. I would like to present to you now Mr. Nihil Set. Mr. Set is the Director of Division for Sustainable Development, Department of Economics and Social Affairs, DESA. He was also the head of the Rio +20 Secretariat, where he spearheaded the preparations for the UN Commission on Sustainable Development Conference in Rio. With over 20 years of service to the United Nations, Mr. Set has served as Special Assistant and Chief of Office to the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Secretary of the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, and the Second Committee of the General Assembly, and as Director of DESA Office for ECOSOC Support and Coordination. Before joining the UN Secretariat, he was a delegate to the UN in the Permanent Mission of India and involved in various UN conferences and summits, including the Rio Summit on Environment and Development, the Copenhagen Summit on Social Development, the Monterey Conference on Financing for Development, the Mauritius Conference of Small Island Developing States, the Millennium Summit, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and the UN World Summit. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Christine, Ambassador Sergeyev, distinguished other representatives on this podium, all you young people out there, ladies, gentlemen. I've been coming to this conference now for several years, and it's such a pleasure for me to be with you and to interact with you and to learn what are your concerns and your priorities. I can, of course, bring to you what are the kind of priorities that the UN is focusing on and how we are looking at this rather complex issue of sustainability as we go ahead. As you know, as Ambassador Sergeyev has mentioned, we did define a set of goals some years ago, 13 years ago, which were called the Millennium Development Goals, and they focused on the basic human deprivations. They focused on issues like poverty, on hunger, on health, on education, on gender equality and empowerment, of environmental sustainability. But what I would challenge you all is to think of the poorest person you've ever known, and to think, what are the forces that act on this person which prevent him from moving up by giving a life of dignity, a life of respect, a life where his hunger, his other needs are taken care of? What are the complex forces that act upon this individual? I'm giving you this challenge only because I want to help you find a segue into what the UN is doing of defining a post-2015 development agenda, which not only looks at the minimum deprivations as we defined in the MDGs, but we go much beyond. And in doing so, let's look at the individual. Let's look at this poor person, the poorest person you've ever met, and let's look at the forces which are acting on him or her. Now, clearly, of course, it's poverty, it's income poverty, it's hunger, it's education, it's health, lack of facilities, access to health facilities. It's the environment that is working against him. It's the oppression, the inequalities that they face. It's the discrimination that is faced in many communities in poor parts of the world. But there are a whole set of other forces acting on the individual. It's the environment he lives in, the kind of sanitary facilities, the availability of water, poor air quality, the threat to life and limb, the lack of security. These are the second set of forces that are acting on this individual. And there are a third set of forces acting on this individual, and these are called the slow onset events. Events like climate change, events like the sort of state of our oceans and what that is doing to the availability of protein and nutrition to them. It's the loss of biodiversity. It's land degradation. So you have these three sets of forces which are acting, which are preventing this person from breaking out from the cycle of poverty and deprivation and to moving into higher trajectories where that person can enjoy a life of dignity. So how do we address these challenges? How do we make sure that by 2030 and beyond, none of these forces operate on this individual, where the individual can break away from all these deprivations to live a life of dignity? And for that, the UN is now grappling with what they call the Sustainable Development Goals. Goals which go much beyond and look much more deeply into these issues than the Millennium Development Goals did. And here, I want to come to the concept of sustainable development, because sustainable development essentially looks at these forces which are economic forces. These are forces which meet the economic aspirations of individuals. There are the social forces, social aspirations of people to move up on the social ladder. And of course, there are these other environmental forces which prevent that individual breaking out. So it's this intersection of economic, social, and environmental forces. And unless they are seen in their totality in a holistic way, we are not going to succeed in breaking out from this trap of poverty and deprivation. So sustainable development is a tool to look at, in an integrated way, of decision-making and other processes which will meet people's economic aspirations, because that's at the core of people's, what motivates people, their economic aspirations, to look at their social aspirations and to look at their environmental fears together in a holistic way. And that's what we are trying to do in the Sustainable Development Goals, to look at the whole series of issues, the intersections of these issues. It's for these reasons that I'm very happy that your topic today focuses on two crucial issues, on health and the environment, because these are very closely intertwined and you can't discuss one without looking at the other. And we know what these intersections are, but it's our ability to see these intersections more forcefully and in all the kind of cross impacts they have on each other, the negative and the positive spin-offs that they have on each other, which is so crucial. And I see from your program, you have a rich program where you're looking at different facets of these intersections. So the way in which you discuss these, the way in which you see these, the way in which you develop ideas around these intersections, that is the core of sustainable development. So it's very important that while you're looking at sustainability issues, on the issues of environment and health, you do explore all these issues. Now let's look at what are these intersections between environment and health, and how can we have a mutually reinforcing process where taking actions on the environment, taking actions on health will be mutually supportive to each other. Let's look at local issues. I want to go into the global commons issues, issues like climate change and oceans and land deforestation, loss of biodiversity and so on a little later. But I wanted to first look at the local impacts of what are the forces, intersections between environment and health. First, I think in large parts of the world, sanitation is such an important issue. And open defecation, the billions of people who don't have a toilet, and what that does to the local health is appalling in terms of dysentery, other diseases, the deaths that causes, how all this gets into the water system, and the kind of impacts that have. So I would say clean sanitation, safe sanitation is one of the most important environmental intersections with health. The second, it was mentioned, I think, by the ambassador, that the whole issue of waste management, particularly in cities, is going to be a very important determinant of the sanitary conditions in which people live. The third is air quality. We know how, for example, issues like motorized transportation, factories using not very clean processes of production, what that does to the particulates in the air, and how that impacts upon health, the respiratory health, the rheumatology, the illnesses which are generated by this lack of clean air. The millions of women and children who die because they use not clean cook stoves, they use biomass for cooking, and what that does to the smoky environment in small homes and the impact that has on people's lives and that quality. Then, of course, the whole issue of water quality, the issue of chemical pollution, the issue of the kind of urban congestion we live in. And remember, as we look to the future, because this, of course, sustainability is your agenda. It's an agenda for the young people. It's an agenda for the future generations. And as we look 20, 30 years into the future, urbanization will be one of the most strongest trends in changes in the way people live and work, and how that is going to impact on the infrastructure of cities, and how all these things that I mentioned on sanitation, on water, on air quality, and on chemical pollution, on particulates in the air, how all those are going to make, in a large part, particularly of the developing world, urban hell for people to have a healthy and healthy life. So these are forces that will be acting at the local level. And on many of these solutions have to be local. They have to be done by the mayors, by local governments, by municipalities, by citizens groups, who have to focus on the ways in which the air quality has to be improved, in ways in which the water quality has to be improved. So these forces are going to be acting very strongly. So these are the local manifestations of the impact of the environment on health. Then we look at the global issues, issues like climate change, what that's doing to vector-borne diseases, increasing temperatures, and what that means for malaria, for example, and what that has to do with water availability, and so on. So there's a whole set of issues which are generated by our lack of taking serious action on mitigating climate impacts and how that's impacting on local health. And this is an issue which is not given as much prominence as it deserves. When we look at climate change, we normally switch our minds totally to the water issues, which is on melting ice, on rising sea levels, on extreme weather events. But all these have deep implications on human health, which must not lose sight of. And on oceans, what we are doing by overexploiting our fish stocks, by making less protein available to people, and what that means for nutrition and health. So there are lots of intersections, whether you look at global issues or you look at local issues, and the impact that has on human health. So health is at the core of sustainable development. It is a right and a goal in its own right. It also means, it is also a means of measuring success across the whole sustainable development agenda. That's why it's important for a meeting like yours to bring to the governments the importance that the health agenda is in meeting the needs of the future we want, to meeting the healthy needs of our future generations. Health encompasses broad well-being. It's not only the absence of diseases. Universal health coverage and equitable access to quality basic health services are issues raised by many governments and by non-state actors. Other important issues which have come up in the UN's consideration of how to look at sustainable development goals are health promotion, prevention, and treatment. Communicable diseases are still a burden in many countries, but non-communicable diseases increasingly affect all countries, highlighting the need to promote healthy diets and lifestyles. There is a need to address access and health needs of persons with disabilities. The discussions that are taking place between governments have highlighted the importance of equal access of women and girls to healthcare services, including addressing women's sexual and reproductive health and ensuring universal access to safe, effective, affordable and acceptable modern methods of family planning. Aging populations is the other big demographic trend, which is posing a major healthcare challenge in many countries. There is a overlap between health risks facing the young and the old. So how do we break through all this? How do we get these intersections? We should focus on getting basic health services to all. We should focus on global partnerships for health and for the environment. We've tried over the past so many years to integrate these economic, social, and environmental issues into this theorem of sustainable development, but the time now has come. And I think your deliberations here, your ability to bring these forces together, to break down the silos which have often helped look at environmental issues separately, health issues separately, education issues separately, inequalities issues separately, to bring them together in a comprehensive and an umbrella sustainable development goals and a post-2015 development agenda will help shake up the governments into viewing things differently, of reorienting their decision-making. So I hope that your wonderful agenda today and your ability to look at different aspects of this problem will enrich the way in which governments also will ultimately look at these issues. And I hope you do find a way. You're a consultative, you've got consultative status with ECOSOC, and I hope the World Information Transfer will be able to bring the messages you hear at this meeting to the relevant bodies to make sure that in our pursuit of this overarching agenda for the future, for the next 30 years, we have these perspectives brought together in a sensible and meaningful, policy-oriented way, in a way which inspires policymakers, which inspires people, which inspires communities, and brings about the change that we want to see in the world. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Mr. Seth, for a very inspirational presentation on all the forces that prevent changes in achieving sustainable development. We hope that we will be able to mitigate some of them shortly. And our next speaker is somebody that has been with us many times, and we always invite him because he gives very, very up-to-date information about very important issue. Dr. Andrew Sauder is a senior project manager of the Electric Power Research Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he leads strategic analysis of advanced nuclear energy systems to support long-term research and development in decision-making. Recent responsibilities also included coordination of government and industry R&D efforts to ensure safe storage of used nuclear fuel over extended periods of time, and technical U.S. industry support of early event analysis of the spent fuel pools following the events of the Fukushima Daiichi plant in March 2011. Currently, he is leading EPRI's international engagement to promote development of enhanced accident-tolerant nuclear fuel. Prior to joining EPRI, Dr. Sauder served as a physical scientist and foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State, addressing international nuclear safety and security issues, including policy, technical analysis, and supporting U.S. oversight of Chernobyl-related programs. His university training and research focus on health physics, radiochemistry, and uranium geochemistry. Dr. Sauder.
Thank you, Dr. Dorbeck. And again, it's indeed a pleasure to be back once again. Thank you again to everyone for inviting me here. And today, given the theme of sustainable energy or sustainability, I have the topic of sustainable energy. So first, I just wanted to call attention to the fact of my organization, EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute. We were, in fact, the result of an issue that renewables today are actually bringing back into the forefront. Following the blackout of 1965 in the Northeast here in New York, I understand there were probably many children born as a result of that blackout. EPRI was established initially as a U.S. organization to address issues related to reliability of electricity. Now we are indeed international. Next. Sorry, I'll say next slide. So first, a little bit of housekeeping. This is primarily a technical talk, but I'm going to try to keep the jargon to a minimum. But first, when I'm speaking about energy today, I'll focus mainly on electricity, first because that's my job, but also because I think everyone agrees having access to reliable, safe electricity is also in the public interest and a key part of sustainability. And when we talk about sustainable energy sources, we really need to discuss or recognize the fact that a sustainable energy source can mean many things to different people. But I think most of us would agree that sustainable energy would be those that produce little or no carbon and other pollutants and emissions. But from a national standpoint, they can also be those that reduce the dependency on foreign sources of energy, fuels, but also reduce the consumption of natural resources. One takeaway is to think about fossil fuels not as a bad actor, but rather as a precious resource that we are actually putting to poor use. Burning fossil fuels is not a very good use of them when you think about what all we use them for in terms of making plastics and other synthetics. Finally, sustainable energy sources, of course, must also be available, affordable, and abundant. Good ideas on paper must be translated into results. They obviously must also be safe and environmentally benign, and, of course, provide for continued economic and social development. Now, in terms of the one unit I might throw around here, and you may have heard it in Back to the Future, I pronounce it as a gigawatt. That's a big unit of power. It's equal to 1 billion watts. And in perspective, that's about the load or demand of a large city like Chicago, about 1 million homes. And so about 1 big nuclear power plant or 2 coal plants or 3 natural gas plants will give you that. Next slide. Okay. No problem. So I mentioned, the reason for discussing electricity here, of course, is I think the clear correlation between having access to affordable, safe, and reliable electricity is, I think, correlated well with human health and environmental health as well as welfare. So what you see on this slide is our UN statistics correlating the Human Development Index versus the percentage of a country's population with access to reliable electricity. And as you can see, there's a clear trend from left to right that with increasing access to electricity supplies, you get better outcomes in terms of your economic development, health outcomes, infant mortality drops, as well as overall quality of life. Next slide. I would also state that in most developing countries, especially in the U.S., I think we take reliable electricity for granted. And for those of you looking down at your smartphones right now, I just want you to pause and give thanks. It was Thanksgiving the other day, for the infrastructure that goes into making that smartphone work and be possible. And part of that is, of course, our electricity grid here. Next. So when I talk about electricity, really that encompasses many, many, many aspects, including what most people think of maybe is the actual power plant. There on the left, you have different sources. For example, coal, natural gas. You have hydroelectric, and of course, we'll get to the renewables, but also nuclear. And those on the left are what we would typically call our base load or our old reliables. These are the ones that you switch them on, and you know that they can run 24/7. If you notice the big red arrow, that's kind of showing the traditional way our electric grid works. The grid is all the components that gets the power from where it's generated to where it's used. Your homes and businesses and industry. And generally, the business model is that it's produced in one place and it goes to the end point of use. So in the middle there is the key, is that substation that you often see sitting around. That takes the high, converts the high voltage current to something that we can all use in our homes. So on the right side, we see everyone in their homes, businesses, as the traditional model says, we're users. This is a zero-sum game, and this is really, I think, one of the key points of my talk, is that for reliable electricity under the current way we have our electricity grid set up, is you constantly, from second to second, hour to hour, day to day, have to match what's being generated with what's being used. You can't have a lot of excess you cannot have a lot of excess electrons floating around on the grid. It has to go somewhere. And to do that, it's really quite like magic. The utilities and the grid operators must constantly monitor and balance that load. And they do that by, one, turning on and turning off some of the generation, but that's only the peaking generation. Only certain types of power plants can be turned on and turned off on short notice. What is really important is actually this bulk energy storage. Right now we have very little on our grid, unless you have a hydro dam that you can use pump storage. You really do have very little storage on the grid today. So everything that you generate pretty much has to be used in that moment. On the other side of the equation, you have customer demand, and of course utilities are loath to tell their customers to shut off their power, their lights, their air conditioners in the summer. So what they do is they make arrangements with big industries that if they need to, that on a short notice, they will shut off their machinery in order to keep this load balanced. So that's the way traditionally we think of the grid working. Next. So in talking about, I think, what most people have in mind in terms of sustainable energy, one of the challenges is we're really reshaping with the more and more deployment of renewables like solar and wind energy. We're really changing the way the grid has to operate. And again, this is like a big battleship or oil tanker. It doesn't change overnight. So a lot of adaptations are needed. Again, this is another takeaway point from this is if you hear a lot of reluctance or you perceive reluctance in utilities and the industry to change, it's not that they're against renewables. It's just it's really hard to do, and it takes some time to do so. It's not insurmountable, but it does take some effort. So what you've noticed here is in the green arrow is now more and more electric generation occurring at what used to be the user end. And if you think about some of the technology that still exists in the grid and at that substation there, it's not used to or was never built or intended originally to handle that two-way, if you will, transmission of electricity. So again, I'm just pointing out some of the challenges there to keep in mind. So next. So again, just summarizing the problems here. You know, we really built our grid. It dates back to in the U.S. at least, to the 19th century, early 20th century, and it was really based on kind of a more tortoise model of this slow and steady wins the race. You turn on your big electric power plants, you keep them running, and especially I'm in the nuclear sector. You know, that's how we operate in the U.S. Our nuclear plants. Breaker-to-breaker performance, where you actually can run the power plant without shutting it down for up to 2 years, without any more fuel being put in there. That's how they make their money, and that's also how the safety record in the U.S., you know, is tied to that performance. It turns out better economic performance is also safer performance. Peaking plants, you may have heard that term thrown around. Those are the small, like natural gas plants. Those were originally built as peaking plants, such that during the summer months, you keep your base plants running, and then when you need a lot of extra electricity on short notice, you can turn on, basically with a switch, a gas-fired turbine, and that keeps your air conditioners running. So this is, again, still pretty much that one-way transaction. Now, what renewables do, again, putting them into context, is that they pretty much change the whole story. Wind and solar, I think we'd all agree, are inherently variable, and that's not a bad thing. We can handle variability, but it's the unpredictable part of that. Because even load, like I was saying, load is variable. But as long as we can predict it pretty well, we can handle that. But it's when the changes happen on over short periods of time and unpredictably that causes problems. And so, again, I mentioned a lot of this new generation, solar panels on your roof, or your neighbor puts in a wind farm, you're a farmer next door, suddenly you have the generation going back the other way. So the existing infrastructure needs substantial upgrades. And again, this is not a cheap or easy or short-term investment. I've heard, for instance, some of the transformers out there, the big transformers, they're no longer made, for example, in the U.S. It can take up to 2 years to order a new transformer. Again, this gets into also disaster recovery issues as well. So you can just see how much utility and a grid operator has to think about making these changes. And there certainly needs to be other changes as well. The marketplace needs to change. The regulations need to change. And then the control of the grid itself needs to change. Going pretty much to more of a two-way communication, kind of more like electric social media. So how does this look for, how do we look for 2035, for example? You know, what will the electric generation look like 20 years from now? 2 decades out. Well, in 2010, the green there is your renewables. We actually had 10% renewable penetration. I believe that includes hydropower. 20% from nuclear. And if you add 10 plus 20, that pretty much gives you your low or no carbon emissions. I'll qualify that as low carbon emissions. And then the remainder, 70% from fossil fuels. Now this slide could be looked at rather depressingly. This is from the U.S. Energy Information Agency. If you're from a different viewpoint, you would probably draw different bar charts. So they're maybe a little bit pessimistic. But basically, if you look over time in these different cases, low gas prices, high natural gas prices, high or low economic growth, you come up with different amounts depending on how much electricity you need and also what kind of fuels you might switch to. But again, if you look at it, the renewables stick around maybe 14 to 16%. Nuclear drops just below 20, and the remainder remains fossil fuels. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. What that also reflects, though, is keep in mind you are increasing the electric power supply, so you have to increase deployments. So more and more of the new generation will be renewables. And you also have to replace old, obsolete power plants, like old coal plants. So again, just keeping pace with the electric power supply is in and of itself a real challenge, especially for nuclear. Next slide. So again, just showing quickly some of the challenges from renewables. Again, I think everyone knows this, but just look at wind variability. And to someone trying to operate the grid and keep the grid up and running, this is not how you want your electric generation to occur, where you can see, okay, on the bottom is time over, looks like minutes, course of minutes, and on the left side you have megawatts, or that's just basically your power output. And then also on your right, something I'm not going to go into, but is hertz. That's the frequency. You know, you've heard of U.S. operates on a 60 hertz system. That's how rapidly our AC power fluctuates. That affects how our electronics operate, and how if you get too far away from that 60 hertz baseline, I think it's 50 hertz in Europe, you can have real problems with sensitive electronics. So you can just see what happens with, let's say, the wind suddenly stops for a second, and your windmill stops generating. Big, big problems. Next. This is just a similar thing for solar, showing, again, even more fluctuations. You can imagine a cloudy day or a partially cloudy day where the clouds pass in and out of the sun. So you can get variability on the order of seconds to hours to days. What happens when you're in the winter and have a cloudy, overcast sky? So again, the challenges here are trying to address this variability over time scales that range from seconds to days. Next. Well, the good news is, you know, again, the deployment of renewable energy, especially in terms of renewable electric generation around the world, is no longer theory. In some countries, the deployment is much greater than, certainly greater than what we have in the U.S. But we have a lot of growing experience base to kind of tell us how we're doing and what challenges lie ahead. How do we incorporate, well, what really is an important new source of electricity for renewables? It's certainly no easy task. So I have on here some stars highlighting some, you know, if I was giving maybe a 2-hour course or a lecture, I might go into case studies for all these. I'm not going to do that. I can see some sighs of relief. But again, I have on here like island grids, if you will. Again, a grid is not one thing. Like Hawaii has multiple grids for each of the islands. Ireland itself is an island nation and largely operates in isolation, although there's a few lines that connect over to Great Britain. Then you also have interesting cases in Germany, Spain, and then Texas itself is an island, and everyone kind of suspects that Texas sometimes wants to secede. Well, it turns out their grid itself is somewhat isolated from the rest of the U.S. Next. So I'm just going to pick on Germany, and I don't mean to pick on Germany as a nation, but it is an interesting example because, one, their shutdown, their moratorium on nuclear energy is driving them to new sources of power generation. Germany is the largest industrial economy in Europe. You need electricity to do that. So they are undergoing a lot of additions of generation capacity other than nuclear. So they're adding certainly an enormous amount of solar and wind. So of their total generation capacity is what they could on a perfect day generate, not what they do. You know, they're starting to approach a third of their power from renewables. That's installed capacity. That's what's on the nameplate when you buy it in the shiny showroom. But if you look in 2013, what the actual generation was, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. For example, I would note, let's see, wind is in purple. About 21% is wind, but the generation is less than 10%, again, for the factors I said. If you look at coal, 25% coal installed capacity, but they actually got over 50% from coal in reality. So you can imagine what that does to their climate goals. Next. Another interesting and very expensive aspect of, like I said, unpredictable availability or variability of generation is shown here. Again, it's too small to see. The point here is on the right, if you see the prices in blue wiggling around there in the blue line there, and you see it circled, that's actually the price of electricity drops below zero. In that case, the prices of generation, an oversupply of electricity, again, I mentioned we don't have storage, is a bad thing. And that's really where the utilities end up having to pay the customers to take their electricity, because there's just too much out there. So that's, again, not a good thing for a market to do, is give away or have to sell their product next, or pay people to take their product next. And then again, I mentioned this importance of baseload and how that changes things. On a windy day or windy week, the green there, that light green there, just shows you how variable, how the wind can pick up and manage your peak demand there. And then on a sunny week below, you see the peaks there are captured by solar. So again, challenge of operating this massive grid is how to balance. It can be done, but how to balance what generation you have at disposal and when you need it. So, next. Who pays for this? Well, right now, largely the customer in Germany. So if you look at the customer rates in Germany, they're now have doubled, or there's been a 50% increase actually in the electric power rates over 5 years. Meanwhile, the industrial rate has been kept low for obvious reasons. Again, you don't want to drive your industry out of your country. But again, you can imagine that may not make your commercial, your public happy for very long. Again, there's no free lunch here. Someone has to pay. So I think the next one's my last slide. So, again, glass half full, half empty message here. The challenges are many, and again, they're not simple or cheap, but the answer is basically to change the way we operate our grid and our power supply. We got to be more flexible, resilient, and that's good for everybody. And we also have to probably increase connectivity. That again, between countries, between national grids and regional grids, that always helps. Also, we have to change the way our energy markets work and the way the regulations work, our policies, and also just simply the way the operators work. But again, I'm from a R&D organization, and I would say another solution to this is technology. Again, and I mentioned another takeaway from this is storage. Boy, once we come up with some reliable and affordable storage technologies like better batteries, even giant flywheels and compressed air, then I think the renewable story will change significantly. And I'll just put up here a fun fact. Next time you drive around and you look up, don't do this while you're driving, maybe when you're a passenger in the car. Check out your little transformers up on the poles there. Some of those are over 50 years old. Some are 80 years old. And again, these transformers represent the largest asset in a grid, if you think about it. Again, we tend not to think about our infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to close. And again, thank you for your attention. And again, think about your grid and think about that. And when you're thinking about renewable energy, a glass half full, half empty story. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sauder, for sharing with us what we need to do to maintain our current energy needs and our quality of life. Our next speaker is Ambassador Thomas Gass, is the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. Ambassador Gass was appointed as Switzerland's ambassador to Nepal in 2009 and the country director to the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. In Nepal, he was the chair of the donors to the Nepal Peace Trust Fund, the main instrument for international support to Nepal's peace process, and the co-chair with the UN resident coordinator of the Donor Coordination Group. He also served as the Dean of Diplomatic Corps in Nepal. Prior to arriving in Nepal, he served as the head of the Economy and Development section of Switzerland's mission to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Gass.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach, and excellencies, professors, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me, as we are getting to the closing of this conference, to express particular thanks to the government of Ukraine and the World Information Transfer Organization for this initiative and its substantive and refreshing and enlightening contribution to the follow-up of the Rio +20 conference and the shaping of the post-2015 development agenda. Today's conference has touched on vital aspects of the economic, social, environmental dimensions of sustainable development, including sustainable energy, sustainable sanitation, sustainable health, technology for sustainable development, and food insecurity. As my colleague Nikhil Seth pointed out in his opening remarks, this conference helps give concrete form to the term science-policy interface by bringing experts and intergovernmental policy shapers and policy makers together in a space in which we can draw lessons from concrete examples and initiatives. One of the important lessons of Rio +20, which is being reiterated in the deliberations of the Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, is that the 26+ issues that were identified in the Future We Want outcome document, including health and the environment, need to be discussed and tackled concretely through partnerships in a cross-cutting manner. This was also very much the spirit of today's discussions. Out of today's conference, I see the reaffirmation of a clear health-environment nexus that intersects with other nexuses that have been identified and discussed elsewhere, such as the water-energy-food nexus. Health for all in a sustainable, salubrious environment can only be achieved if there is sustainable energy for all, sustainable water and sanitation for all, and nutritious food for all and access to relevant technology. Health cannot be isolated from all these other factors that influence human health, which in the prosperous parts of this world and the prosperous parts of poor countries are taken for granted. Health and the environment and partnerships for their promotion need to be an integral part of the post-2015 development agenda. By mid-century, we'll be living in a world that may have grown from the present 7 billion to some 10.3 billion people. Already the world population is consuming 1.5 times the annual capacity of the Earth to regenerate itself. We are depleting natural capital rather than regenerating it. Alongside the overconsumption by the fortunate in both rich and poor countries, over 1 billion people are severely deprived in terms of basic needs for health, food, water, energy, sanitation, and education. Accelerating climate change, now confirmed with 95% certainty by the IPCC to be caused by humans, is putting the present and future livelihoods at risk. Increasingly frequent natural disasters, food shortages and rising food prices, scarcer water and deteriorating soils are affecting health and well-being of people everywhere, but most severely in the poorest countries. Accordingly, member states of the UN, as well as major groups and other stakeholders, are relying on 5 guiding principles for the post-2015 development agenda. Firstly, leave no one behind. Secondly, keep sustainable development at the core of the agenda. Thirdly, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth. Fourthly, build peace and effective, open, accessible institutions for all. And finally, forge a new global partnership. At the center of the post-2015 development agenda are expected to be a set of sustainable development goals. The goals of the new development agenda will need to build on the progress achieved through the Millennium Development Goals, as this was reminded by several speakers today. The Millennium Development Goals have inspired the world to reduce by more than 1/2 the percentage of those living in absolute poverty. Yet, inequality across and within countries, including in access to health and a clean environment, has increased since the dawn of the new millennium. We need to finish the job started by the Millennium Development Goals so as to ensure the social inclusion of all those who are deprived and to protect future generations from deprivation. The new development agenda will need to give special attention to ensuring jobs for all, including, in particular, youth, who in some regions face over 50% unemployment. The new development agenda will also need to heal the planet by counteracting the depletion of natural capital through decoupling economic growth from natural resources use. Health for the planet is invariably and directly linked to health for humans. The acute economic and fiscal crisis that most regions face today is leading to reductions in the social safety nets and on which many people depend, including in key sectors such as health and education. Health and education are often the first victims of fiscal austerity in both poor and rich countries. Today's event should play an influential role both through its outcome as well as the work of the individual countries and organizations represented here to ensure a health and environment-sensitive post-2015 development agenda with a set of global partnerships to implement it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Gass, for a very comprehensive summary of the session.